afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Carlo and Brian for organising today's event and for inviting me to participate. Following James Turk's keynote speech this morning, I feel like I should confess that the research I'm going to present on today is a result of collaborative doctoral research that I undertook at the University of Liverpool in collaboration with Tate Liverpool. But I hope that you'll find that I have managed to maintain some academic freedom, well, a little bit more than the cosy examples that James spoke about this morning. My paper today examines education in the Neoliberal Museum, focusing on the example of Tate Liverpool. But before I go on to critically assess the museum's educational methods and practices, I think it's important to give some background information on what makes Tate Liverpool a distinctly neoliberal museum. So firstly, the Tate organisation as it stands today is comprised of 4 museums which are home to Britain's national collection of British and international modern art. Tate Liverpool was the first of 3 branches established in the past 3 decades, in addition to the original 19th century Tate Gallery, now known as Tate Britain. So we've got the 19th century original gallery here, Tate Liverpool established in 1988, Tate St Ives established in 1993, and Tate Modern, which has opened in 2000. This recent phenomenon of museum expansion through the establishment of additional branches in other locations is obviously not unique to the UK, as we have also seen in this time the establishment of a new Guggenheim in Bilbao, northern Spain, a new Pompidou Centre in Metz in the Lorraine region of France, not to mention the current interest of the Louvre and the Guggenheim in expanding to the Middle East. This type of museum expansion has already received much criticism from art historians such as Rosalind Krauss and Alan Wallach, among others, who argue that the establishment of additional museum branches signals variously the industrialisation or the marketisation of the museum, which, like any corporation, now expands to increase its global market share. In my paper today, I attempt to build on such criticism, which has tended to focus on museum buildings and exhibitions by examining how these expansions have affected the museum's educational role and methods. The expansion of Tate has been all the more remarkable as it has occurred at a time when the century-old tradition of public funding to national museums in the UK has been retracted in favour of greater entrepreneurialism. This shift towards a complex private-public funding mix for national museums began in the 1970s with Margaret Thatcher's commitment to decreasing public expenditure and privatisation of formerly public assets. It was maintained by the subsequent new Labour administrations of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and has more recently been intensified with renewed vigour by David Cameron's current coalition government. Tate has paved the way for other national museums in the UK in generating income from corporate sponsorship, private donations, membership schemes, retail catering, publishing and so on, to the point that funding allocated by government now represents less than a quarter of its annual income. And this speaks to what Jeff was saying about the funding of universities too. So we see here that grant and aid, which is the public funding of Tate, represents less than a quarter of its income in 2012 to 13. So to illustrate how this works in practice, I'm going to begin to zoom in now on the case of Tate Liverpool, which was founded amid a period of tumultuous urban change resulting from the decline in Liverpool's port in the 1980s. Liverpool's strategic location in terms of transatlantic sea trade had, in the 18th and 19th century, earned it the title of the second port of empire, and it was unique among British cities in that its population was more economically dependent on the port and related refinery industries than on manufacturing right up until the 1960s. The port was weakened by interwar depression and the gradual loss of empire in the early 20th century, and suffered further from the collapse in transatlantic sea trade, entry into the European economic community and the advent of new technologies like containerisation in the 1970s. So by 1981, when plans for Tate Liverpool were being conceived, Liverpool City Planning Department recorded 20% unemployment, a dramatic rise from the 5% recorded in 1966, and job losses in their hundreds were making daily headlines in the local press. Characteristically, the Thatcher government's response to these circumstances was to exploit Liverpool's devalued local labour force and urban environment to the benefit of corporate capital investors. Thatcher's strategy for achieving this in Liverpool was to transform the city's economic infrastructure from highly unionised forms of port-related employment to low-paid and highly competitive employment in new industries of tourism and retail. In 1981, central government formed the Merseyside Development Corporation, or MDC, to redevelop 944 acres of Liverpool docklands, essentially removing local government and local people of the right to determine their city's economic future. The Albert Dock was to be MDC's flagship development, working to the model of tourist-oriented waterfront development pioneered by the Ruse Company in the US. MDC restored water to the central plaza of the dock and converted the 4 blocks of warehousing to contain a mix of retail, office, luxury residential and museum spaces. Tate's then director, Alan Bowness, who had been seeking solutions to expand Tate's display space, agreed that Tate would play its part in promoting tourism in Liverpool by establishing its first additional branch on the Albert Dock. In its willingness to exploit the devalued labour of Liverpool's built environment and built environment of Liverpool, Tate can be seen as Britain's prime example of a neoliberal museum. Perhaps not surprisingly, MDC's activities were met with local hostility and criticism for failing to address the most urgent problems of chronic unemployment that plagued the city at the time. As a crucial component in MDC's regeneration of the Albert Dock, Tate Liverpool did not escape this hostility. Toby Jackson, Tate Liverpool's first head of education, has recalled how the reception when the new museum was opened to the public in 1988 was mixed and contained much adverse criticism, particularly from the city and local communities. And we can see from this quote from one of Tate Liverpool's early education reports that there were many people living in the city who would be extremely reluctant to approach Tate's hallowed doors, that many indeed would be positively hostile to everything that the gallery appeared to represent: high art, intellectual elitism, pretentious upper middle class entertainment, and Merseyside Development Corporation money. So in an effort to diffuse this local hostility and to demonstrate the new museum's relevance to the local population, Tate Liverpool embarked on a new type of education programme, distinct from that which had been offered at the original Tate Gallery in London. As another early planning document proclaimed, Tate Liverpool wanted to move away from the traditional education programme of talks, lectures and written material focused on explaining art to an audience comprised mainly of social groups A and B. The audience, in this case, would be blessed by the knowledge passed on to them by the expert in the art gallery. Educational strategies in museums and galleries have radically changed over the past 10 years, and the Tate Gallery Liverpool programme reflects this change and aims to meet the needs of our new audience. At Tate Liverpool, the shift away from transmission methods of museum education listed in this quote has been characterised towards a shift towards constructivist learning theory. As I'm sure the educators in this room will be aware, constructivism proposes that knowledge in the museum is constructed in the mind of the learner, who actively integrates the experience of the objects and information on display with their own personal repertoire of prior knowledge and experience. This quote's reference to the most wealthy and educated A and B categories of the UK's National Readership Survey indicates that constructivism was also seen to offer the potential to address criticisms, most famously of Pierre Bourdieu and Alain Darbel, that the museum privileged the aesthetic knowledge, experience and taste inherited through an upper middle class upbringing and education. In theory, constructivism offered a model that validates the unique knowledge and experience of every visitor. In practice, however, Tate Liverpool has opted to address various types of knowledge and experience, appointing education curators that specialise in learner categories such as schools, families, young people, community groups, adults, etc. These education curators research and observe through outreach work and advisory groups the various types of prior knowledge and experience that these categories of people bring to the museum. Employing these specialist observations, each education curator designs a bespoke programme of resources, activities and events that facilitate the construction of knowledge in the museum by guiding the learner on what features to look for in the artwork and how to connect it with their knowledge and experience. These various strands of Tate Liverpool's education programme are underpinned by one discussion-based workshop method that can be practiced on-site at the museum or in various outreach environments. This method, known as Ways of Looking, organises discussion into 4 stages of response: the personal approach, looking at the subject, looking at the object, and looking at the context. And we can see from this section of looking at the subject the kind of discussion techniques that the educators at Tate Liverpool use, asking people what is the work, what is it about, what is happening, and so on. And there's sets of questions like this for each stage of the method. The perceived success of this method within the organisation has led to the adoption of Ways of Looking across other Tate museums and its publication in the form of a handbook for school educators. In assessing Tate Liverpool's claim for this constructivist method as a less elite or more egalitarian mode of practice, it's important to distinguish constructivism from autodidacticism. As George E. Hine, in his influential text, The Constructivist Museum, is careful to point out, in order to make meaning of our experience, we need to be able to connect it with what we already know. In the Constructivist Museum, then, the authority of subject knowledge, that is how or why art is made, is replaced with the authority of epistemological knowledge, that is how meaning is made from art. Tate Liverpool's emphasis on enabling this knowledge construction, excuse me, I've lost my page. Tate Liverpool's emphasis on enabling the knowledge construction process implies that at least some, if not most people, are considered unable to independently look at a work of art and connect it with their own existing knowledge and experience. It implies that they lack the knowledge of how meaning is constructed from an artwork, a knowledge crucially that Tate Liverpool's educators possess. We have seen how, at the point that Tate Liverpool developed its constructivist method, traditional museum education practices had been rendered obsolete by the growing acceptance that knowledge is socially contingent. I propose that this awareness created a moment of instability for the museum education profession. If there were multiple subjective meanings to be made from a work of art, how did the museum now have any claim to cultural authority? Tate Liverpool and other constructive museums exploited this moment of instability as the role of the educator turned from one who knows the meaning of an artwork to one who knows how meanings are made. Tate Liverpool's claim to a knowledge of meaning construction that those who construct the meaning do not possess can be seen as an attempt to enhance the professional status and epistemic profile of the museum educator. Tate Liverpool's constructivist methodology therefore assumes what Jacques Rancière calls an inequality of intelligences as its starting point. This inequality is invoked not only in the claims for the education curator's authoritative specialist knowledge, but also in its categorisation of the public as various types of learner. If all of Tate Liverpool's visitors are considered equal in any sense, it's equally dependent on the superior knowledge of the museum educator to make meaning from what they encounter in the museum. For instance, a visitor may come to the museum first as a child when the family or school's programme will enable her to make meaning from the work on display. The visitor may return again as a young adult, at which stage the Young Tate programme will prompt her to make meaning that is relative to her knowledge at that time. And then again, as an older adult, depending on her interests or work responsibilities, the adult, family, academic or teacher's programme can help her to construct knowledge from what she sees. At each stage of their life, the learner's ignorance, that is their presumed incapacity to independently make meaning from what they see in the museum, is reasserted by Tate Liverpool's educators. They can never learn enough to liberate themselves from their subordinate position in the educator-learner hierarchy. The epistemic community of the museum educator resides above all others, as even professional educators like school teachers must be enabled in the apparently specialised process of constructing knowledge from art. It can be concluded from this that, far from representing a departure from elitist methods of practice, Tate Liverpool's constructivist methodology recreates them afresh. As a final point, it's worth noting that Tate Liverpool's practice of researching learner categories and creating differentiated interpretive products to appeal to or serve the needs of these groups brings to mind what Pascal Guillen has identified as neoliberalism's transformation of education into one big catering business. It gives customers the impression that they can choose anything they like, made to their own measure, while in fact it delivers mass-produced, standardised products, which brings us back to education, which gives students, consumers, the impression that they can choose and study highly individualised programmes, but in fact treats them to the mass-produced competencies. At Tate Liverpool, we have seen how the mass-produced competencies of visual literacy and reflexive thinking underline all of the supposedly diverse educational resources and activities on offer. The audit culture that now accompanies public funding to museums in the UK causes Tate Liverpool to aggregate the use of these products and programmes as visitor demand in order to secure financial resources for further development and expansion. The development of relationships with local people and the aims to meet their needs, demands and expectations has been used as justification for all other further developments to Tate Liverpool's building. In conclusion, I argue that local hostilities towards Tate Liverpool's role in neoliberal urban change, combined with the instability that socially contingent theories of learning presented to the museum education profession, has caused Tate Liverpool to develop educational methods which cultivate an inequality of intelligences in order to create a dependency on the perceived intellectual superiority of the museum educator and the programmes that they design and deliver. By this method, Tate Liverpool generates representations of visitor need and demands that are used to fuel its own expansion.